Thank you, John. I was actually scheduled to give this very talk about 8 years ago. It was the last time I talked to this group, and I surprised John at the time by saying, I don't want to talk about the Dead Sea, I want to talk about dead folks. And it was actually the first, and we've had several since then, and we're going to have a big one in October, and I sure want to be there. They've got a great cast of speakers. But it was about near-death experiences and the evidence supporting the duality of a soul and a body has become so strong as a result of these near-death experiences. People being able to confirm things that they had no way of knowing. And one of the speakers that I saw was has actually written there are probably 200, 300 books out, most of them first-person accounts of what happened to them. But I really look forward to that, and so now, after 8 years, we'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Have you ever made a point of trying to talk to someone and your point was validated, or you brought it up as a result of something you saw in the Bible, and they would respond, "Oh, the Bible? Are you kidding? It's so full of contradictions, it's full of myths, it's unscientific, it's racist, it denigrates women." And it's changed so much over time that we don't know if we have the Bible, the right Bible. And finally, you call it the Word of God, but it was written by men. So these are a few of the responses I've heard over time when I would quote Scripture or say, well, you know, the Bible says this, the Bible says that. Now, RTB does an excellent job of dealing with these first two categories. That it's full of myths and that it's unscientific. And that's been the whole thrust of Reasons to Believe. There's been very little. There's been some, and I'll talk about it today, dealing with the last two. And that is, has the Bible that we have now, how close is it to the originals? And I had originally intended this talk to deal with all 66 books of the Bible, the Old and the New Testament. But the more I got into looking at this very fascinating story about the Dead Sea Scrolls, I thought, well, that's too much. It's scattering out too much. And then I focused even more on the book of Isaiah and finally chapter 53 in the book of Isaiah. And all that will become apparent. But the evidence for an unchanged New Testament is just as good as what I'm going to present today, but it's totally different. Different arguments, different evidences, and perhaps we can deal with that in a future lecture. Now, before zeroing in on the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have been called the greatest archaeological discovery of all time. And it's not just believers who make that assertion. I've seen secular archaeologists and scholars say pretty much the same thing. This discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls back in 1947 is considered, if not the greatest, certainly one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time. And a lot of times when people talk about them, they don't emphasize the points that I'm going to make today. And that is, my 2 points are that the Dead Sea Scrolls show that our Bible, and here I'm focusing on the 39 books of the Old Testament, that our Bible is relatively unchanged over time. There have been some changes, yes, but no significant doctrines or events have changed over time. The other one is this matter of divine inspiration. Yes, as Christians, we We don't believe that God wrote the Bible and then handed it down to someone in a leather binding and with a concordance and all that. Instead, what we do believe is that a group of people, I think it's been estimated to be at least 35 men over 1,500 years, have written what we have in the Bible, and that they were inspired. And people go back and forth, exactly what do you mean? I don't mean dictation, that they hear and write it down. Instead, they were moved by the Holy Spirit to say certain things and to make certain prophecies. So, with that behind us, let's get into a little bit of how, in general, archaeology supports the Bible. Now, this lady here is Elliot Mazar. She's been called the Queen of Jerusalem archaeology because she actually discovered what we now consider to be accurate, the King David's palace in near the old city of Jerusalem. She once quipped that, she said, I do my work with a Bible in one hand and a spade in the other. And, you know, an exaggeration, yeah, probably so. Of course it is. But she underscores the point that a lot of archaeologists will read the Bible, they'll say, oh, this is supposed to have occurred here, let's go over and look. And they dig, and sure enough, they find it. And she's not the only ancient Near East archaeologist to make a statement like that. Time and again, critics have charged that certain things in the Bible absolutely did not happen. They're the result of fabrication. I think my favorite is the Bible makes 50 mentions of a group of people called the Hittites. And the so-called scholars of the German scholars came in, I guess it was in the 1800s, were saying there's no evidence of the Hittites. Well, archaeologists have turned up evidence of the Hittites. They were one of the strongest, most powerful people groups in the 15th and 16th century BC. In fact, if you wanted to study about Hittites, you can actually take a course called Hittitology from University of Oxford and from the University of Chicago as well. Okay, let's focus now a little bit more on the reasons why this claim that the Bible has changed over time is a serious one. This assertion that the Bible has radically changed over time has given rise to many religions and many cults. The picture you see on the left is someone depicting the angel Gabriel appearing to Muhammad, who was a Arab merchant back in 610 AD. I think this was when this occurred. And he claimed that the angel Gabriel appeared to him and told him that the Bible has been corrupted over time, and I'm going to give you an updated version. And we know that today is the Quran. And similarly, I've got depicted on the right a young man in upstate New York back in early part of the 19th century, said that two angels appeared to him and told him the same thing. This was 1832, Joseph Smith, and he later wrote the Book of Mormon based on, again, an updated Bible, because the Bible we have today has been corrupted, or so the claim goes. Many cults have done the same thing. You've heard of Mary Baker Eddy, Emanuel Swedenborg, the Branch Davidians, and many others have been based on the fact that some leader has been approached by an angel or God directly and said, hey, I'm giving you some new insight. The Bible that you have now is wrong. Here's the right word. So it's important to be able to show that the Bible has not changed significantly over time for that reason. Also, you see among theological liberals an opportunity to question verses that they're very uncomfortable with, dealing, for example, with homosexuality or perhaps the exclusivity of the Christian religion. It's kind of, did God really say that? And where did we first hear that phrase? Did God really say that? It's Garden of Eden. It's been around a long time, and people are still asking that. And one reason they ask it is based on the assumption that we don't have the Word of God. So we're going to deal with both those today. And as you see, the other objections have been dealt with quite a bit by RTB. Some of them, have not been dealt with. I'll get it, John. Thank you. Okay. So what we're going to do today, to some extent, is we're going to compare the words in our Bible today. Specifically, we'll be looking at the book of Isaiah and what was uncovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They basically serve as a time capsule. You can go and look at one and compare them to the other and look over a large span of years and say, don't see much change. Of course, we don't have the originals, and people can always say, well, something happened between the writing of the original and the oldest copies that we have. But we do know how meticulous the Jewish scribes were, and we'll talk about that a little bit. What I want to do first, before we get into these key points, is tell you the background story of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We want to look at how they were discovered and how they ended up today, such that you can get on the internet, and if you go to the right site, and if you can read ancient Hebrew, you can see every one of the scrolls in every fragment for yourself. That wasn't always the case. There were many decades where the authorities didn't release the information to the public. We'll also see who produced these scrolls, these copies. And finally, before we get into the main points that I want to get into, we'll see how they were preserved over so many years. You know, after hearing this story, you may come to the conclusion that I did, that it wasn't a mere accident that these scrolls are now in our possession and that we can see them. So many things could have gone wrong. Now, the initial discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls happened back in 1947, a few months before Israel declared its not its independence. Yeah, I guess you would call it its independence in 1948, and the UN voted to approve it, and Israel became a nation once again. This was back in 1947 when this land was called Palestine, and it was under the rule, the authority of the British government. There were two goat herders, and they were walking along the western shore of the Dead Sea with their goats. One of them scrambled up an incline, and we'll show you a picture of that incline in a little bit, And one of the goat herders, they were both named Mohammed, by the way. One of them, that was his first name, one of his last name. One of the Mohammeds grabbed a rock and he threw it at the goat, wanting to get its attention before the goat wandered in a cave. Well, he missed the goat, but the rock went in the cave and he heard a shattering sound. And he thought, that doesn't sound natural. So a few days he came back, and that was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He found several pottery jars, and after he lifted up the lid, he found parchments that had strange writing on them. Now these were Bedouin. They were tribesmen. You can still see them if you go to Israel or the Middle East today. They're herding their goats and sheep. Some of them have become quite wealthy, not through the sale of goats and sheep, but through other means. But they still carry on their traditions as they have for thousands of years. So these Bedouin tribesmen, once they discovered these scrolls, they had no idea what they were, but they could tell that they were made of parchment, leather skins from sheep or goats, and they took these, they saw these parchments, and they said, this would make good shoe leather. So they took these parchments. They had no idea what the writing was. They took these parchments to a cobbler in Bethlehem, and fortunately, the cobbler was a Christian, but even more important for the preservation of these scrolls, he dealt in antiquities, and he knew right away that these had a higher value than shoe leather. So let me show you a picture of these guys. The one on the left is Mohammed, and the one on the right is Mohammed. Or maybe it's the other way, I don't know. But anyhow, this was 15 years after their discovery, and they'd become very well known by that time. So the cobbler was a Christian, as I said. He was Eastern Orthodox, specifically Syrian Orthodox, and he took the scrolls to his archbishop, the archbishop who lived in Jerusalem. And if you go today to Jerusalem, you'll see that the Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, all the different branches of Eastern Orthodox faith are very active in the old city, and they were back then in 47, of course. So he took them to the cobbler took them to his archbishop, and the archbishop looked at them, and he thought maybe he could sell them. So the cobbler got $100 for 3 of the scrolls. There were 7 that were found in the cave. One of these scrolls that almost ended up on the soles of shoes that Palestinians would have been wearing was the great Isaiah scroll. And that's really going to be my focus for much of the rest of this talk, is this 20-foot long Isaiah scroll that is complete. Most of the other scrolls are partial. They're tiny little fragments, but this scroll is complete. And it's going to be the focus of the rest of my talk here. So when the first Arab-Israeli war broke out in 1948, if you'll remember, Israel declared its independence, and immediately 7 Arab armies from surrounding countries descended on Israel. In Israel, if you read the story of this, and I don't want to get off in it, again, it seems very much like the hand of God was there. Even the British were against them at that point, and yet they prevailed. And there's been subsequent wars, and will probably be more in the course of the years, and each time Israel prevails. But that's another story. Once Israel had declared and won its independence, And the value or the age of these scrolls had been roughly determined. The archbishop decided he could make a lot of money. He only paid $100 to the cobbler, but he could make a lot of money by going to New York City and advertising the sale of these scrolls. So here in our next slide, I'm going to show you, he went to the Wall Street Journal and he went to their want ad section, their classified section, and he offered the scrolls for sale. There it is. It's highlighted in yellow. And let me read you what that classified ad says. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. It took him a while. He actually offered it to several universities. They weren't interested. But a it was the father of Israeli archaeologists, decided he got with some other Jewish financiers, and they purchased them for $250,000 and gave them to the newly independent Israel. And over the years, the Israelis have added to that collection. So let's fast forward to the present. Let's talk about where these scrolls are now, how many of them are there, what's in them. There are now more than 900 partial or complete scrolls, and there are more than 20,000 fragments. Now, I said there were 39 books in the Old Testament, all but the book of Esther. 38 books have been found, some of them multiple copies, and comparisons can be made and have been made between the Hebrew of those scrolls and the Hebrew in the current Bibles that we have, of course, translated in the English for us. And there have been very few changes, and that's of great importance, and I want to get into that more. But let's keep talking about the scrolls, how they were preserved. Excuse me. The scrolls were found along the Dead Sea. Obviously, that's why they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls. They have been discovered in 11 caves, and more recently some have been discovered in places other than caves. But the great majority of them are in caves, and they're in ceramic jars, just like the ones that Muhammad found. These caves are located along the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Now, you can see that where the star is right now. Here is Jerusalem. It's only 20 miles as a bird flies, a little bit further as you drive down that slope, but it's only 20 miles from the old city of Jerusalem to the site of these Dead Sea Scrolls, these 11 caves. Here is the Dead Sea, and it is the lowest spot on the face of the earth. It's the lowest spot of land. Of course, the oceans go deeper. It's 1,400 feet below sea level. Jerusalem, by contrast, is 2,600 feet above sea level, 3,900, 4,000 foot difference. And it's a result of this escarpment, which is called the hill country, and it looks quite a bit like the hill country of Texas. Same limestone geology, karst geology. The hill country catches the moisture off the Mediterranean, and it acts like a sponge. It collects that moisture It comes down as precipitation, and then once the winds carry it over the ridge, they're dried out. And so the Dead Sea, and especially the area where these caves are one of the driest spots on the face of the earth. They're also one of the lowest spots. That is one of the reasons that these scrolls have been preserved so accurately. The other reason is they were made on animal skins or on parchment. Now, after we finish here, I invite you to go over to the pool table, and you'll see some old Bibles, 400 years old, 4 pages from 2 different Bibles. They're all from Georgetown. Most of them belong to John. One of them, my sister, who's in the audience here, brought. But they are the original printing of the King James Bible. And when you see them, you will be very surprised how well they have been preserved, because they're made on something other than the type of paper that we use today, kind of a very thin parchment. And that's exactly what the Dead Sea Scrolls were. They were made on animal skins, and in some cases a derivative of plants. But either way, they are much better preserved than the paper documents that we use today. Okay, so the geology, the climate contributed to the preservation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but another thing did, and it's their inaccessibility. There you'll see a couple of the caves, and the caves are formed in a type of soil, maybe rock. It's very unconsolidated, called marl. I drove through some of that today between here and Kerrville. And so, as I said, there's a lot of similarities. Here, the marl is very thick. It's very easy to dig into. It's very difficult to climb that slope. You only go there if you really know you need to get in there. And so the people who produce the Dead Sea Scrolls knew they would be safe by hiding them in these caves. So as I said, once the scrolls were discovered, and they're still being discovered, by the way, there was a long delay between the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls, either through photographic means or allowing scholars to come in and look at them, and between, I guess it was in the late 1990s, that eventually all the scrolls were made available to the public. And again, you can't actually go up to them and look at them. They're preserved under conditions that will keep them in the same condition for many, many years. Like I say, if you go back after we break here and look at the documents that we have that are 400 years old, you'll see that preservation, it is possible to preserve documents like this for long periods of time. And the Israelis have done a great job. Let's talk a little bit about where the scrolls are now. Well, first I want to talk about how the scrolls have been dated. How do we know, for example, that this document right here, the 20-foot long Dead Sea Scroll, was in fact copied 200 years before Christ? And that's critical. That's a key point that I'll be making today, is that these documents were produced before the time of Christ. It's estimated 200 BC. They're two techniques. One you're probably familiar with is carbon-14. Carbon-14 dating can be used on objects that are once have been alive, and that would be plants or animals. The other is they need to be less than 50,000 years old. Now, there are other dating techniques that use the same radiometric dating, but they go back millions of years. But carbon-14 is only good for objects that have been around for 50,000 years or less. So carbon-14 dating, and there have been a lot of chemical dating, a lot of labs have tested these things. They all come out pretty close for the Isaiah scroll to be 200 years before the time of Christ. There is another technique, and this other technique also jives pretty well with carbon-14, and it's called paleographic dating. And I mention that because, like I said, RTB has been involved a little bit in the field of archaeology, and only a few weeks ago, for those of you who keep up to the Reasons to Believe website, you may have seen, there we go. This was an article in the Reasons to Believe blog section. I think it's called Other Voices or something, but it's under their blog section. And it's a couple of scholars that are associated with Reasons to Believe, one of whom is John Bloom, a professor. And I've been in touch with John Bloom for aspects of this lecture, but he has done dating of these scrolls and using the paleographic method. And what the paleographic method is handwriting changes over time, the style of handwriting. In other words, first graders who are no longer taught penmanship, but say someone who was taught it in the 1960s, their writing will look distinctly different than someone who was taught in the 1860s. I didn't realize that. I thought it was more a function of the individual rather than the time, but apparently paleographic dating works as well too. So again, the dates can correspond pretty closely to each other. There are some error bars, but all of them put them before the time of Christ, and that's critical. Okay, what's in the scrolls? I was surprised to learn that the scrolls, only about a fourth of the scrolls are actual Old Testament literature, books. Like I said, 38 of the 39. The other 80% are commentaries, Jewish commentaries on these books, are apocryphal writings. That is, writings that were produced but were not decided either by the Jewish authorities or later on by the Christians in roughly 300 or 400 AD, that these are not inspired writings and therefore don't belong in the Bible. There are some of those. The great majority of them are diaries, and their rules and regulations, calendars. The rules and regulations have to do with how the group of people who discovered or who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, copied the Dead Sea Scrolls, how they should maintain their society. So again, only 20%, but remember I said there were 20,000 fragments and almost 1,000 complete scrolls. So the volume of material is a lot, but only about 20% of them are actually copies of Old Testament books. Okay, who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls? The consensus of scholarly opinion is that these scrolls were written by a monastic group of Jews called the Essenes. Now you can read a couple of places in the New Testament, you'll hear about the Essenes. not near as much as the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Herodians, all these groups that one time or another opposed Jesus for what he was saying and doing. But the Essenes stayed to themselves. Like I said, they were monastic. They lived down on the shores of the Dead Sea, and the reason they had separated themselves from the Jews in Jerusalem was that they believed they had become morally corrupted, and a lot of the objections that Jesus raised against the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Essenes had the same objections, and their response was, hey, we'll just move away. And so that's why you don't read that much about the Essenes, but they were a fairly good-sized minority, and again, they were largely situated down on the shores of the Dead Sea. Let me ask, how many of you have been to the Holy Land and taken a tour and seen some of these places where the Dead Sea Scrolls were? Okay, good, good. A standard part of a Holy Land tour is to visit Qumran. Qumran is where the Essenes lived. This is the archaeological excavation, still in progress. They have found what they consider inkwells. They found where they have found where the scrolls were actually written, where they were stored, library, that sort of thing. There's very little doubt that the people who wrote, who produced, copied, I'll get it straight here, the Dead Sea Scrolls actually lived in Qumran. Okay, another question. Why did the Essenes hide their scrolls? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the text in chapter 13 of the book of Mark. Jesus was walking with some of his disciples, and one of them commented when they were walking past the temple how beautiful it was, how big it was, just talked and how awed he was about the temple and the walls. And Jesus prophesied at that time that these walls are going to be destroyed, the temple will be destroyed, and not one stone will rest on another. That, of course, was around 30 AD. In 70 AD, that happened. The Romans came in, they were tired of the Jews rebelling. They came in and destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and the Roman historian, actually he was Jewish by ethnicity, but he had become a Roman citizen. His name was Josephus, and he writes that the city was destroyed to the extent that not one stone rested on another. And it was this invasion by the Roman general Titus in 70 AD that caused the Essenes. They knew the Romans were coming. They gave plenty of notice, and the Essenes started digging these caves, started preserving their texts. They knew that the Romans would come down and destroy everything. And so it was at that time and for that reason that the Dead Sea Scrolls were preserved. Okay, one other background topic, and that is, where are the scrolls now? The Israelis have done a great job of preserving the scrolls. They're in the ownership of the Israeli Antiquities Commission. If you're in Jerusalem, and I've been there twice, but I haven't availed myself of the opportunity to see the museum, this museum right here. The structure on the left that looks like a flying saucer is actually where the Dead Sea Scrolls are preserved and where they're housed right now. The shape of the building is made to look like the top of these ceramic jars where the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden. The picture on the right is the Isaiah scroll. And it's a copy. The actual one is preserved. The entire building has been designed such that it is partially underground, can go completely underground and be sealed off should any of Israel's neighbors make good on their threat to bomb Jerusalem. It can withstand a nuclear attack. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are in good hands and are very likely to be preserved for some time. All right, now let's get into really the meat of what I wanted to present today, and that's the significance of these scrolls to our faith. As I said, the Dead Sea Scrolls provide excellent evidence to rebut the claim that our current Bible has changed significantly over time, such that it's no longer authoritative and reliable. Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest Old Testament and the oldest complete Bible was what's called the Leningrad Codex, and it was dated to, it was produced in 1008 AD. So 1,000 years ago, roughly, we've been able to compare the Bible that we have now with the Leningrad or St. Petersburg, it's been called both, Codex that dates back to 1008 AD. But this left a gap of 1,700 years between, and again I'm going to focus on Isaiah, when Isaiah began his ministry and the current copy that we have now of his book. Let's look at this in this graphic. Here we are now, 2020, 2021. Here is the Codex from the Leningrad Codex dating back to 1008 AD. Here's the time of Christ. 400 BC is approximately when the last book of the Old Testament was written. 700 BC is when Isaiah was written. So prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you had this kind of gap right here. That left plenty of time for critics to say, well, yeah, we can go back 1,000 years, but we're looking at 2,200 years. Surely there were changes. So now let me show you the same graph after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This line right here represents how much time was closed between, I think it's roughly 1,200 years, between the St. Petersburg Leningrad Codex and the copy of Isaiah that was discovered in cave number 1 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now you still have some gap in here, but we can project back and look and see that there were very few changes over this long span of time, and the Bible that we have now. But the other thing that we know is the tradition that the Jewish scribes had of copying. Now they didn't have photocopiers like we have now, but they were almost as good. They would be very scrupulous. They actually wrote from right to left in writing when they copied, and then they would hand it to one or two other scribes. Those scribes would count the number of lines in the copy that they were copying from, and they would also look at the first letter of each line, count the number of lines, count the number of letters, and if it was not exactly right, they would destroy it. So obviously they were very meticulous, and this tradition goes back to before the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we have every reason to believe that what Isaiah wrote And what we have is very similar, not exact, but very similar, with no changes that are significant to events or to biblical doctrines. The important thing is that I show here on this slide that the copy of the original Isaiah scroll dates back to 200 years before the time of Christ. Now, why do I keep emphasizing that? Why is that so important? It's important for this reason. The book of Isaiah, like many other Old Testament books, makes many, many predictions about the Messiah. We're going to get into that in just a little bit. But the predictions in the book of Isaiah, and in particular, chapter 53 of the book of Isaiah, are so exact that many Jewish rabbis claim, oh, obviously somebody came in and changed this scroll. It's been monkeyed with to make it look like the life and ministry of Jesus. But if you have a copy that dates back 200 years before the time of Christ, that would be utterly impossible. So that's why finding this scroll lays to rest the objection that someone came in and made it look like that Jesus had fulfilled these prophecies by actually inserting or changing the prophecies. Let me read you what Josh McDowell, who wrote the book Evidence Demands a Verdict, says about this discovery. He said, the Dead Sea Scrolls now closed the gap by over 1,000 years and left the world waiting to see if the text had been transmitted accurately. The answer was a resounding yes. So as I said, what accounts for that has been the meticulous nature of the Jewish scribes to make sure that what they copied, it was actually a matter of importance to their religion, that they felt like they were dealing with something divine and that they had no right to change. As I said, the original documents, we don't have. None of the 66 books in the Old and New Testament do we have the originals. So why are we dealing with copies? What happens in both the Old and New Testament is that these copies, the original, once it was written, whether it be, say, Paul's book, letter to the church in Galatia, Corinthians, whatever, once it was received, people would copy it and give it to other churches. So it was copied for the reason of distribution, but it was also copied because over time, these things were handled so much, they get worn out, and again, especially with the Jewish scribes, it was a matter of their religion that once it got dirty or used or torn, it had to be replaced. It was a holy relic, so to speak. And so that is why we have copies and not the originals. The originals have been worn out, and in no case in any of the 66 books of the Bible do we have the originals, but we've got old copies. And with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we go much further back in time. I'm going to illustrate how few changes have occurred between Isaiah's writing and the current Isaiah that we have now. And I'm going to use chapter 53 of the book of Isaiah. And the reason is, as I said before, in chapter 53 is the biggest concentration of prophecies about the coming Messiah. And so I think it's important to focus on that chapter. Norm Geisler was a Christian apologist. He was also a Hebrew scholar, and he looked at chapter 53. He looked at what was in the Isaiah scroll, and let me show you the results of his analysis. He says there are 166 words in chapter 53. Now keep in mind, the chapters of the Bible, both the Old and New Testament, didn't come into existence until much, much later. But what would have been chapter 53 in the great Isaiah scroll, Norm Geisler looked at, he said there are 166 words, only 17 letters within those words are changed from the current version that we have and the one in the Isaiah scroll. 10 of these are updated spelling. For example, if you go, and this is another reason why I think it'll be useful for you to look at these 400-year-old documents that are back here on the pool table, try to read the English. It'll be a challenge, and they're only 400 years. Language changes over time. It also changes geographically. If you've lived in Canada, I know Sarah has, or traveled in Canada or England, you'll see that they spell the word color differently than we do here. They add a U. They might say we dropped a U. The word sinner is spelled differently. And so you have changes, and obviously the scribes decided to make these changes. Again, I said most of them probably did not, because they treated the documents as religious objects, but apparently some did. So we have, of those 17 letters, not words, but 17 letters that were changed, 10 of them were updated spelling, 4 had to do with conjunctions, and only 1 was a word. And I had intended, in fact, I don't have a slide with me, but I actually saw what the word was, and it was the word light. And it was right next to a reference to the Messiah. And sure enough, if you're familiar with the Apostle John, he constantly referred to Jesus as a being of light, as the ultimate light. And Jesus himself referred to him as the light. So, given those statistics, Norm Geisler says we have a 99% quality of transmission, 99% accuracy. And this is typical. Some of them are not 99%, but it's typical of what you find in the other chapters in Isaiah and in the other books of the Old Testament. Okay, I began this lecture dealing with a variety of excuses people give to reject the Bible as a source of authority and a guide for their lives. I said I would address 2 of the objections, and one of them we've been focused on for the last several minutes, and that's the unchanging nature of the Bible. And again, this lecture is focused on the Old Testament over time. But I also made a claim that the Dead Sea Scrolls underscore another aspect of the authoritative nature of the Bible, and that there is a sign of supernatural influence, divine inspiration, if you want to call it that. And let me explain why it is the Dead Sea Scrolls show this. And it's not, this is simply one line of evidence supporting divine inspiration. There are hundreds of prophecies in the Old Testament speaking of a coming Messiah. The problem that was posed is the great majority of the prophecies deal with the fellow on the right. There's a Messiah that's coming that will bring eternal peace, will rule with justice, will put down the enemies of Israel. And that was the Messiah that was being talked about and hoped for about the time that Jesus came. Now, there is another picture of the same Messiah. Sometimes they just interchange the descriptions. One verse will say this, and the next one will also talk about the Messiah as being what Isaiah calls a suffering servant who will come, who will be timid, who will be rejected, and who will be killed, and who will die for the sins of his people. Well, if you were being ruled by the Romans and you wanted to throw off the yoke of their rule, naturally you would want the guy on the right, the Messiah who is a future king and ruler. And again, like I said, Isaiah speaks of both. Now, Christians resolve the paradox by asserting that Jesus is the Messiah, and he came once, first as a suffering servant, and he will come again, the second coming, at some point in the future to bring in a 1,000-year reign followed by an eternity in heaven. And that's certainly one of the courses of future events that most Christians subscribe to. And that's how we resolve this paradox of these two different messiahs. Now, as I said, the Jews were disappointed. In fact, even the disciples, up until the night before Jesus were crucified, they knew he was the Messiah, and they were ready for him to do his stuff, but he didn't. And they were very disappointed. And it wasn't until these same disciples saw Jesus after he had resurrected that they understood what was going on. And at that point, they ceased to be timid and scared, and they become powerful spokesmen for Christianity. And we're told all but one of them died a violent death without recanting their faith in Jesus. So this was a big transformation, the disciples seeing the risen Christ. But even up until the time of his death, they were hoping that he would be the coming conquering king. And then after they saw him resurrected, they figured, aha, he's coming again. And that's where we are today. In the interest of time, I want to give you a sampling of some of the prophecies that were made in the book of Isaiah that were fulfilled in the life of Christ. And my point is that these prophecies were so precise and filled so exactly by Christ that it had to be supernatural inspiration for Isaiah to have written them down. And so the next 4 slides are I'm just going to show a few of the estimated 40 prophecies that appear in the book of Isaiah. And by the way, if you want, I'm going to go through the slides quickly. If you want a copy of this talk, including the slides, if afterwards you give me your name and your email address, I will send you this and you can look at them in your leisure. But we're going to go through, in the interest of time, fairly quickly. Isaiah 7:14 talks about the virgin birth. And Micah, another one of the Old Testament writers, even says that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, an astounding prediction, given that Bethlehem was just a nothing in terms of size and importance at the time Micah wrote that. Isaiah also prophesied that the Messiah would be a descendant of David. He predicted that the Holy Spirit would physically descend upon the Messiah, which is exactly what happened at the baptism of Jesus. In this next slide, you'll see that Isaiah and also the psalmist referred to the resurrection. They also referred to the crucifixion, and there was a reference to Jesus dying between transgressors. We know that his biographers, the gospel writers, said that he died between two thieves. Again, an amazingly precise prediction. Here we see Isaiah, and again, most of these are from Isaiah 53, prophesied that the suffering servant would be despised, he would be rejected, he would be grieved himself, and his message would be disbelieved. And as we know now, even today, most Jews do not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, although there are growing numbers of what are called Messianic Jews who do believe that. There's also the verse many of you have heard before, that through his wounds we were healed, by his stripes, these stripes coming from the lashes of the whipping, and it's through those wounds, the shedding of that blood, that we are healed from our sins. Again, and all of these are from Isaiah 53. We see that the suffering servant would bear the sins of the world. He would be cut off, which is the term they use for he would be killed. And this one is really amazing. He would be buried in a rich man's tomb. As those of you who have studied or read through the various accounts of the crucifixion and Jesus' burial, it was in a rich man's tomb. And that it was God the Father's will that this happened to the Messiah. Now, these are a few of the 40 different prophecies that are in Isaiah. And Isaiah, throughout the Old Testament, are several hundred prophecies about the coming Messiah. Again, a lot of them are focused on the second coming of Jesus, but many enough are focused on the first coming that, again, we have no explanation other than divine inspiration of the scriptures. Now, the question about these and other fulfilled prophecies from the Bible is this: was it just luck or coincidence, or is it a demonstration of supernatural inspiration of the prophets? And how do we distinguish between the two? Luck, coincidence, or supernatural inspiration? I think the best example that I can come up with is, I don't play the stock market, but let's say I did, and I bought, over the course of several years, I made 3 or 4 transactions, and each time, within a day or so, the value of the stock that I bought doubled in value. Could we say that had to be a divinely inspired decision on my part, something supernatural, or was it just luck? Either one might be reasonable, but say I made 20 such purchases, and I even sold my stock a day before the stock crashed. I think it would be reasonable to assume that indeed I had insider knowledge. Now that's illegal. It's illegal if you have insider knowledge that other people don't have to go and trade stock. My contention is Isaiah had insider knowledge that could only be of supernatural origin. Now, I've been focusing on Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, the Isaiah scroll, mainly because it is the best preserved and the only totally complete scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls. As I said, it almost ended up as shoe leather back in 1947. So I want to conclude this presentation by making a case of, if you take Isaiah and you take all the prophecies in the Old and New Testaments, it would be folly to say that the Bible was not divinely inspired. Now, in 2003, Hugh Ross wrote an article, and in that article, he stated there have been 2,500 prophecies in the Bible, of which 2,000 have been completed exactly as they were stated. And he says if you give each chance of occurrence as 1 in 10, and I think that's a conservative number, but let's say 1 in 10, and each one was independent of the other, the chance occurrence of 2,000 of 2,500 prophecies being fulfilled exactly as they said they would be is 1. The chance would be 1 in 10 followed by 200 zeros. That's an incredibly large number. For comparison, the number of atoms in the entire universe is 1 in 10 times 78, or 78 zeros. So even if you were to assume that 90% of those are kind of vague, and some of them are vague, you are still left with a staggeringly large number of completed prophecies. And it's the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls show that these prophecies were not made after the fact, but before the fact, that I say that the Dead Sea Scrolls also contribute not just to showing an unchanged Bible, but showing that it was divinely inspired. So that concludes my remarks, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Let me go to the microphone just real quick. So we do want Bob to be able to answer some questions. I would like to say a couple of things before we get to the Q&A, and really just want to make sure that I don't forget. We have a book table over here that has a lot of books that are available, but also DVDs of past presentations. I encourage you to go over there and check that out in the notes. And if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Bible leaves that
Sure,
are over there on the pool table. So the first one I came across, an ad in a magazine was advertising that they had original 1611 King James Bible leaves, and so I called it was in an archaeological magazine that I subscribed
Not the Wall
to.
Street Journal, won't ads.
Not the Wall Street Journal. And I called, and it was a shop in New York, and he had about a dozen of these leaves, and I asked him what books they were from. And he started to read me the names of the books, and the first one was Tobit, and the next one was Maccabeans, and then he read the next one, and I was like, oh, I forgot. 1611 King James had the Apocrypha. And I was like, well, that makes sense. Nobody wants the Apocrypha leaves. That's why he's got them available. And so he got to the last one, and he said, and the last one is St. Luke. I thought to myself, and I said, I'll take it. That's the one I want. So that one is on the table. That's the original 1611. There are two others. One is, I learned that the more valuable leaf is one that begins the book. And so the one that begins the book often has more elaborate artwork on it. And so there's one of those from the Bishop's Bible and one from the Geneva Bible, which were from the 1500s.
Oh,
so about
okay.
450 years
Yeah.
ago. And then the fourth one that I have is a leaf from the 13th century University Bible.
Oh my goodness.
So that one is over 800 years old.
Wow.
That one was not via the printing press. That one was handwritten. It was also on vellum, which is lambskin. And that University Bible is the very first Bible that contained all the books within one cover.
Wow.
Prior to that, they were too big to be contained in one cover. And
Did
you
not
can tell
know that.
by the thickness or the thinness of the vellum that was very important. The other thing about the University Bible is that that was a time period when the Bible was divided into chapters, but not yet into verses.
Oh, okay.
So when you look at that Bible, you'll notice that there are no verses, but you do see a chapter.
Interesting. Yeah.
And the other thing about that is it's so small, you just wonder how people could have read that back during that day without those glasses. Anyway, so I would encourage you to go over to the pool table and check those out. That'd be very interesting. So Q&A, 2 rules here. First rule is that if you have a question, please ask a question. Please don't go off on a 5-minute dialogue of yourself, giving your opinion of things. If you need to set up your question, please feel free to set up your question, but please honor our speaker by asking the question, letting him share his knowledge on the subject. Second point, I'm the president. President gets to ask first question.
Uh-oh.
Okay, so here's my question. In your research of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I guess it's a 2-part question. One is, did you run across anything that said what the oldest date was for any of the copies? And the second question involves the type of text, because I know that during the Hellenistic period, which is during the 300s and 200s BC, that the Hebrew letters are different than when the Bible was written. Isaiah would have been in the 700s, but even before that, say Moses or during the United Kingdom time of David, the Hebrew letters was an archaic text, which is completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could read the Hellenistic Hebrew, you couldn't read the archaic Hebrew. Do you know if any of the Dead Sea Scrolls contained any of the archaic Hebrew? Have you run across any of that?
The Dead Sea Scrolls have been dated to within a relatively narrow time frame. None of them so far have been discovered before, say, roughly 350 BC. So you wouldn't see those type of changes. With regard to how Hebrew has changed over time, there's no evidence that Hebrew was in existence at the time that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, were written. The best that conservative scholars can say at this point is that it was Moses, during the time of Moses, that these what appears in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were transmitted orally. But as far as I know, no one has any record of Hebrew that far back. I don't know how things changed between time of David and Solomon and the time of Isaiah, so really can't answer that. Any other questions? Yes.
I thought I read something that might be completely different, but there was some text that was found that was so welded together it would destroy it to pull it apart, that they had an MRI or something that could read the pages, set the depth like by micrometer and read the pages without ever opening it. Did you ever hear of anything like that?
Was this associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls?
I thought it was parts that just were so mashed together that it would just destroy.
That could very well be. I don't don't remember reading about that, but there's been a lot of analysis done using very high-tech equipment, and that could very well be true. Any other questions?
Bob, was that the only copy of Isaiah?
No, they have found 7 complete scrolls of Isaiah, are almost complete. The very first one that was found in Cave 1 by Mohammed is the one on display and is the most complete. The others are, say, 90% complete, but apparently Isaiah was very popular with the Essenes.
Those two, Muhammad and Muhammad, are they still alive? Or?
Well, look like, let's see, that was 47. They were probably teenagers. Who knows? I haven't heard that, but if they are alive, they're 10 years older than me. So they're old men. Any other questions? Yeah.
So 200, if I remember correct, 200 BC is when the Septuagint, like the Greek Old Testament, was it 200?
The Septuagint was actually written earlier than that. You know, at the time of Jesus, the language that they used was Greek. New Testament's written in Greek, a little bit in Aramaic. So the Greek language was popular in as far back as I think 350. I'm not for sure, but the Septuagint actually predates the Dead Sea Scroll. Again, I don't know how old what the oldest Septuagint version of the Old Testament is. It may only be 1,000 years old. I don't know, but you're right. Any other questions?
I'm not familiar with the location of where the Dead Sea Scroll excavations are. Is that Israeli territory or Jordanian, or is it under the control of the Israeli government where the scrolls are being excavated, or is that another?
No. As a result of the 6 Days War, I think it was, Israel now controls the west side of the Dead Sea. So that's why you can easily take these tours in the Holy Land and go down to Qumran. My wife and I have actually swum in the Dead Sea. It's saltier than the Great Salt Lake, and you don't have to do anything. You just float. It's so salty. But all that's a big tourist area now in terms of people making tours or pilgrimages to the Holy Land.
Yesterday, I was curious. I went to Google Earth and went to Qumran on Google Earth, and it said that the Dead Sea Scrolls are a national park now. So they are an Israeli national park.
Okay, yeah. The archaeological excavation is now a park, yeah. At the time we visited it, it wasn't, but you're right, I think it is, yeah.
Are there reasons why people believe that the Book of Esther was not found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, or any fragments of that? Or?
No, this may be a pure coincidence, but it's only the Book of Esther where you don't find God mentioned. I think it's a great book. In fact, I know a guy that's writing a Broadway musical right now about the Book of Esther. It's a great story, but it just, it may turn up. I never saw anything that said we're not going to copy this book because it doesn't mention Jehovah, but no, I don't know.
Yes, I was wondering, when was the Essenes' last writings or the last things that we got from the Essenes, through archaeological discoveries and everything?
70 AD, that's when the Romans came down, and after that, nothing from the Essenes. They died along with the other folks at Masada. If you've been on a Holy Land tour, you've seen that again. So, any other questions? All right, well, thank you guys. Appreciate it.